Most people believe that Israel was always destined to be in the Middle East. But did you know that Uganda and Argentina were also considered as potential locations for the Jewish state? So why did they ultimately choose Palestine, a land surrounded by Muslim nations where conflict seemed almost inevitable? Was it purely a humanitarian gesture after Holocaust, or part of a deeper geopolitical strategy designed to keep the region in turmoil? So if you want to discover the real reasons behind Israel's creation and explore the role superpowers played in shaping this highly contested land, stay put, because it's coming up. To understand why European powers pushed for the creation of Israel, we first need to delve into Europe's long-standing fear of Islamic expansion. This fear was not born out of the blue in the 20th century, but deeply rooted in centuries of historical encounters. The Arab invasion of Spain in 711 AD under the Umayyad Caliphate was driven by a desire to expand Islamic rule across non-Muslim territories. The conquest of Spain led to the establishment of Al-Andalus, or Andalus, an Islamic state that existed in Europe for nearly 800 years. The atrocities that accompanied the Arab invasion, including forced conversions, the imposition of the jizya, a humiliating tax on non-Muslims, and the destruction of churches, created lasting scars on Europe. Quranic verses such as Surah At-Tawbah 9:29, which demanded non-Muslims pay jizya or face violence, justified these conquests. This Islamic expansionist ideology was powered by the religious principle of jihad, or struggle to spread Islam beyond the borders of Dar al-Islam, or the land of Islam, into Dar al-Harb, or the land of war. Centuries later, the Crusades were launched by European powers in a direct response to this Islamic expansion. European leaders, driven by both religious fervor and a desire to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, united under the banner of Christendom. These crusades, or military campaigns initiated by popes and monarchs, were Europe's way of fighting back against what they saw as a threat to their Christian civilization. This collective action shows that Europe's fear of Islamic dominance was more than just rhetoric. They acted on it historically to repel Islamism in real action with their own force as far as possible and reassert Christian power. Similarly, the Ottoman Empire, which expanded into Europe under a similar Islamic expansionist banner, conquered the Balkans and threatened the heart of Christian Europe. The Ottomans not only seized the vast territories, but also committed atrocities like forced conversions, mass enslavement, and the destruction of Christian cultural heritage, reinforcing Europe's anxiety about Islamic rule. The Siege of Vienna in 1683 was a turning point where European unity once again pushed back the Islamic invasion. The Ottomans' failure to capture Vienna symbolized Europe's resistance to being engulfed by Islamic rule. While the fear of Islam was grounded in historical invasions, Europe's relationship with the Jewish people was more complex. For centuries, Jews were treated as outsiders in Christian Europe, often scapegoated during times of crisis. Antisemitism ran deep through European history, from the expulsion of Jews from England in 1290 to their forced removal from Spain in 1492, to the pogroms or genocides and systemic violence of Eastern Europe. Much of this discrimination stemmed from religious biases, particularly the Christian belief that Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus. But beyond religious animosity, Jews were often resented for their economic success. Restricted from owning land or joining many professions, Jews turned to finance and commerce, becoming prominent in these fields. Historical examples such as Rothschild family in 19th century Europe fueled stereotypes of Jewish financial control and led to further resentment. Throughout history, Jews also frequently found themselves positioned close to power, whether in the courts of Muslim rulers in Al-Andalus or within the Achaemenid Empire, where they were granted political privileges. This upper-class status further alienated them from Christian societies. One other reason that makes more secular Europeans still discriminate against Jews is that they like to handle their daily matters according to their religious texts, and the element of theocracy is strong amongst them, a theocratic methodology which also stands out among many today's Muslims. By the early 20th century, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I marks the end of direct Islamic rule over European land, and Turkey got influenced by nationalistic laicity rather than Islamism. However, the memory of Islamic invasions from the early Arab conquests to the Ottoman sieges still loomed large in the minds of European powers. So they divided Islamic territory into separate countries with the philosophy of divide and control. Before we dive deeper, let's address something many might not know. Palestine wasn't the only option considered for the Jewish homeland. In fact, Uganda and even Argentina were seriously debated as potential sites for the creation of Israel. But in the end, Palestine was chosen. Now think about this for a moment. Why choose a land surrounded by Muslim nations when they were clearly safer in less volatile alternatives? Yes, I know, the so-called Holy Land is where the ancient Israelites once lived. But they had left that land almost for good centuries ago. It wasn't just about a return to ancestral roots. There was a clear awareness of the potential conflict this move would spark with the surrounding Muslim nations. Here at English Rumi, we believe the Israeli people have every right to live in their ancestral land, especially if it was acquired peacefully. Yet it seems that the verse from the Hebrew Bible which declares Canaan, or today's Israeli-Palestinian lands, as the promised homeland of the Jewish people, held far more significance than global peace. After all, religious texts often carry more weight in the political realm than modern diplomatic solutions. To see how religious text promotes violence in Middle East, watch this clip of ours. As we unravel this, let's remember, politicians even in the free world rarely reveal the full truth. The media may give us the headlines, but what's really driving these decisions is often hidden under layers of power, money, and geopolitical strategy. When you start to peel back these layers, the pieces begin to fall into place. The creation of Israel wasn't just about giving Jews a homeland after the horrors of the Holocaust. It was about creating a geopolitical situation that would serve interests of superpowers for decades to come. Now imagine the strategic discussions behind closed doors. Europe had two groups they felt incompatible with, the Jews and the Muslims. Europe's history with both had been turbulent for centuries. Even though the 20th century was more secular compared to the crusading days, cultural biases still ran deep. Europeans no longer had the religious zeal that fueled crusades for the Holy Land, but they certainly hadn't overcome their age-old disdain for Jews or Muslims. The anti-Semitic undercurrents were still very much alive, and despite being more secular, Europe didn't necessarily see Jews or Muslims as equals in their society. Why? Because both groups still heavily and closely followed their religious texts, while Europe had largely moved toward secularism. So perhaps the idea was simple. Why not create a situation where these two groups are in constant conflict with each other rather than with us? By placing the Jewish people back in their ancient homeland, right in the heart of the Middle East, surrounded by Islamic nations, they ensured that the region would be locked in a new perpetual conflict. Israel's presence would trigger tensions and keep the Islamic Arab world preoccupied with fighting a new internal enemy rather than challenging Western influence. The secularized Europeans did not have religious sensitivity in Jerusalem any longer. They were not crusaders anymore, but they were well aware of the sensitivities of Muslims and Jews and their intersected holy landmarks. Now, this wasn't just about placating Europe's Jewish population after the horrors of the Holocaust. It was also about solving a much larger geopolitical puzzle. Creating a Jewish state in Palestine ensured that the Arab and Islamic nations would focus their energies on the new state, preventing any unified effort to push back against European and American interests in the region. In short, the Middle East became a chessboard, with Israel strategically placed to stir tensions and keep the game going. Documents such as the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which Britain officially supported the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, illustrate this multi-purpose strategy. Britain, weary of anti-Semitic tensions at home, saw the geopolitical benefits of creating a Jewish state that would serve as a bulwark against Arab and Islamic ambitions in the region. But the plan to establish Israel had one issue that superpowers had to address. The Jewish state was much smaller in both population and landmass compared to the Islamic nations surrounding it. To ensure Israel's survival, Western powers and even the Soviet Union in its early years equipped Israel with more advanced technology and weaponry. Israel's victories in its various wars with Arab nations were heavily dependent on the technological superiority. From 1948 onward, Western countries, particularly the United States, ensured that Israel always had the upper hand in military technology. U.S. officials such as Henry Kissinger stated that Israel's military dominance had to preserve for stability in the region. Israel's superior military equipment allowed it to win conflicts decisively, including the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. While Western powers played a significant role in supporting Israel, the Soviet Union's involvement is often overlooked. In fact, the Soviet Union was the first country to officially recognize Israel after its declaration of independence in 1948. Then mass emigration of Jews from Soviet territories to Israel was ignited, reaching its peak in the 70s as Soviet Jews sought refuge from oppression. These immigrants significantly boosted Israel's population, workforce, and military capabilities. It's also interesting to note that out of the top 13 Bolsheviks who led the 1917 Russian Revolution, 5 were Jews, who were a very tiny minority in the whole Russia. This historical fact speaks to two key ideas we've already explored. First, it shows the political acumen or ingenuity of the Jewish people, who have historically found ways to integrate themselves into the highest levels of governance wherever they settle. Second, it reflects the underlying fear within the Soviet government that Jews, with their influence and capabilities, could one day lead another revolution or infiltrate key political positions, potentially altering the communist regime to favor Jewish oligarchs, a fear that Adolf Hitler had too. The Soviets were obviously not fully committed to Israel. Like the US and Britain, the Soviets played a delicate game of diplomacy, maintaining official ties with Israel while simultaneously backing Arab or Muslim nations just on the surface in the region's subsequent conflicts. They provided military support to Arab nations, largely motivated by the desire to secure alliances and profit from the region's oil wealth. However, unlike some Islamic nations that sought Israel's outright destruction, the Soviets were more focused on benefiting from keeping the Middle East in a state of control and stability. This complex dynamic between global superpowers, Israel, and the Muslim world is a testament to how much control these external powers exerted over the region. Their interest in keeping the Middle East in a state of constant conflict ensured that neither side would become powerful enough to challenge Western or Eastern hegemony directly. Fascinatingly, when the Arab-Israeli conflicts began to lose momentum in the late 1970s, new waves of tension emerged from within the Islamic world. Two Arab nations, Egypt and Jordan, eventually made peace with Israel after decades of war, with the last major conflict being in the early 1970s. But in the late 1970s, the Islamic world saw the rise of a new force, the Iranian Revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini, an exiled cleric, found refuge in France, where he received significant Western media coverage, amplifying his message across the world. This media spotlight allowed Khomeini to gain widespread support, and he ultimately returned to Iran to lead a radical Islamic revolution. This movement led to a new wave of anti-Israel sentiment in the region and intensified extremism in various branches of Islam, sparking more regional conflicts. To watch how Khomeini fooled the ordinary to give into his Islamic dictatorship, watch this clip of ours. Here is a quick PSA. If you want to support our cause, consider buying us a coffee at our buymeacoffee.com page. Some of our videos, especially the ones where we critique religions, get slapped with the not advertiser-friendly label faster than you can say heretic. Your support keeps us going and keeps the truth flowing. The formation of an Islamic theocracy in Iran further destabilized the region, increasing the complexity of Middle Eastern geopolitics. It's no coincidence that as one conflict waned, another rose to take its place, keeping the Middle East in a perpetual state of instability, much to the benefit of global superpowers. The Middle East became the front line of wars between Eastern and Western superpowers. Keeping conflict alive there serves multiple purposes. First, superpowers can profit by selling weapons to Middle Eastern countries while using the region as a testing ground for their advanced military technologies in real battle conditions. Secondly, these conflicts keep the oil-rich nations of the Middle East distracted from using the resources to develop technological advancements that could make them stronger militarily and politically. A technologically advanced Islamic nation could potentially be very dangerous. Islamic ideologies, particularly in the form of hegemonic political systems disguised as divine religions, pose a real threat not only to Europe but also to superpowers like Russia and China. This is why you don't see Russia providing Iran with its most advanced military equipment, such as Sukhoi fighter jets. Even though Russia may appear allied with certain Islamic regimes, it is still wary of Islamic expansionism and doesn't want to risk giving such powerful weaponry to nations with these ideologies. And no Islamic nation would be ever allowed to have nukes except Pakistanis, who are very busy competing with India rather than European powers. One might argue that regional powers seek to expand their influence, and Islamic regimes aren't unique in that regard. But the difference lies in how Islamic regimes operate. They don't just want to expand geopolitically, they aim to impose their belief system on others, either by converting them to Islam or subjecting them to jizya, or in extreme cases, executing those they see as non-believers. Islamic regimes also force their way of life onto others, dictating how people live, enforcing hijabs for women, banning singing or dancing, and enforcing segregation between men and women in public spaces like schools, beaches, and recreational areas. We've previously discussed how life under Islamic regimes can look in another one of our videos. But it's essential to note that this is part of why Israel's role is so critical. Israel serves as a buffer that prevents Islamic barbarism from spreading beyond the Middle East. Interestingly, Benjamin Netanyahu, in a speech before the American Congress, said that Israel is a strong blockage that protects the West and Europe against Islamic barbarism. Is partly right. However, he fails to explain why Western leaders won't allow Israel to completely destroy Islamist factions like Hamas, the group that's often portrayed as one of the outcomes of Islamism in the region. Clearly, world powers want the conflict to continue simmering in the Middle East, as this benefits them economically and geopolitically. This geopolitical strategy has proven highly effective for global superpowers, offering several advantages. By positioning two theocratic groups, both of whom act significantly or partially based on their religious texts against each other in 20th century, the superpowers secured ongoing regional conflict. Wealthy Jews and oil-rich Islamic nations were locked into an arms race, with Western nations and even Russia and China profiting by supplying weapons to both sides. Yet they ensured that Israel always had a technological edge. This strategy forced oil-rich Islamic nations to channel their vast resources into military spending rather than technological advancement or territorial expansion into Europe. To this day, there isn't a single Islamic country fully dependent on local resources for advanced high-tech manufacturing. If the influence of political Islam were fully purged from the region, Islamic nations would likely experience a surge in political, economic, and technological growth, potentially rivaling the Renaissance-era boom in Europe. For now, oil wealth is deliberately funneled toward regional security and the unattainable dream of spreading Islam by force. Until the people of the Middle East themselves fully reject the grip of Islamic rule, global powers will continue to exploit this dynamic for their own benefit, keeping the region and its conflicts firmly within their control. Until real peace emerges, perhaps this is the world's way of being intolerant toward the intolerant. This was another message of peace and tolerance, but we stand firm and direct against the intolerant. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and make sure to check out our other videos in this channel. If you found this video enlightening enough, share it with as many as people you know. Till later, peace.